This week on Q&A, a look back at the life of writer Arthur Kessler and his 1940 anti-communist novel Darkness at Noon. Biographer Michael Scammell talks about his new book, Kessler, the Literary and Political Odyssey of a 20th-Century Skeptic.
Michael Scammell, author of Koestler, why did you decide to open your prologue the way you did?
I did it partly for dramatic effect and partly to achieve my favorite form in literature, which is a circle, and partly because I did see it as symbolic of much of Koestler's life. That is to say, he had tried in vain, but he tried his whole life to exercise control over what he was doing. He constantly thought about where he was going, what he was thinking, what he was writing. And then again, there had been at least 3, possibly 4 attempts at suicide earlier. So it seemed to me to have great symbolic effect.
Let me read just the first sentence. On Tuesday, March 1st, 1983, Arthur Koestler and his wife, Cynthia, entered their sitting room at 8 Montpelier Square, London, sat down facing each other, he in his favorite leather armchair, she on the couch, and poured themselves their usual drink before dinner. Then what?
Then what? Well, that drink was laced with something else. And it was, obviously, it was a drink designed to kill them. They took their drinks with a great deal of morphine. I think that was the drug of choice. Koestler, who, by the way, was a prominent member of the Euthanasia Society in Britain and had written a preface to their pamphlet on self-delivery, as it was politely called, knew all about the various ways to bring about a death. And the curious thing is that this is a man who, in his life, had led a vigorous and ultimately successful campaign to abolish capital punishment in Britain. He did not believe in the death penalty, which he thought was barbaric, but he did believe in suicide. And so, as I say, this act was symbolic on so many levels.
What was wrong with him at the time, physically?
Well, of course, that sort of dilutes, if you like, the romantic image of suicide, because he was suffering from leukemia at the time and also Parkinson's disease. And he had been deteriorating for a couple of years by that point. And he made it clear, he told his friends, he told his wife, he told everyone that he would end his own life.
How old was he?
He was, let's see, 75. No, I'm sorry, 78.
And how old was she, and why did she commit suicide with him?
Well, she was 58. She was 20 years younger. She, according to the note she left, felt she was extraordinarily dependent on him, which I show in the book, especially in the later section of the book. She lived entirely for him, lived through him, if you like. She decided that she couldn't face living on her own, and since the means were there, so obviously, and since she, at this point, was the fitter of the two, and therefore responsible for administering them, decided that she too would take her own life and go with him.
I want to go to where I think the American connection is for this on page 199 and just read it and then get you to expand on it. Whittaker Chambers, then an obscure journalist at Time magazine, but one who had reason to understand the book, called it, quote, the most exciting novel of the season, written by someone who, quote, knows Russia and the deep places of the human mind. And other critics echoed his high opinion. Quote, from then onward, said Koestler later, my financial troubles never became pressing, unquote. Whittaker Chambers and the book, what was it and why was it important to this country?
Well, Darkness at Noon we're talking about, of course. Well, Darkness at Noon was important on a number of levels. On the perhaps most superficial level, it offered an explanation for something that had been baffling Westerners in particular for many years, and that was Stalin's show trials and the success that he seemed to have. The very early trials that were held in the Soviet Union were held in secret, in camera, because the authorities didn't trust their apparatus, if you like, and their methods. But by 1937, they were holding these trials in open court. Foreign correspondents were present. And leading Soviet ministers and officials, Nikolai Bukharin was the most prominent one, actually confessed in court to a series of crimes which struck people as fantastic. But there were these confessions. What could they say? And many prominent people in the West, I seem to believe that Bernard Shaw was among them, but there were others, took these trials at face value. And even those who were inclined to deep skepticism found that the trials were orchestrated so beautifully that it was very hard to find where the seams were. Well, Koestler, who was still a communist at the time these trials began, but was shaken by the thought that people he knew, he had met Bukharin in Moscow, he had met other Soviet ministers in Moscow, couldn't believe that they had done this. And so he set out to investigate not only the methods, but the psychology of the trials. And he adopted a rather interesting approach. First of all, he was steeped in Dostoevsky, so I think that both Crime and Punishment, with its kind of detective story atmosphere, was one of the influences on him. I think another influence was the Brothers Karamazov, also by Dostoevsky. But he set up of course, a show trial has a detective story element anyway, but he set it up as a kind of psychological duel between the defendant, based in part on Bukharin, and his interrogators. And he based the behavior of the interrogators on his own knowledge of the Soviet Union when he'd been there for a year and a half in the early 1930s. So he offered, first of all, he offered a key to the way these things were conducted. But more important, he offered a key to the thinking of the defendants, the people who confessed. And he did it by actually projecting some of his own feelings. He had been feeling guilt. He had felt guilt from his early years. It was one of his sort of dominant emotions, if you like, one of his dominant driving forces. But he had begun to move well away from the party by this time. He had one foot out of it, if you like. And he tried to and he had actually been attacked at a party caucus in Paris for one of the books that he'd written. So he tried to, he actually drew on his own psychology to project it into Bukharin. Why would he feel sufficiently guilty to confess? And so he, in the novel, he discussed the arguments that were put forward by the interrogators, pointing out that when he was a loyalist, Rubashov, as he's called in the novel, had actually been responsible for the deaths of many people. And so he used Rubashov's own conscience against him, so that Rubashov, in the end, confessed that, yes, he was guilty.
I've got the paperback version of Darkness at Noon, published in 1941, still in the bookstores. I found it, easily found it. Why, though, did Whittaker Chambers have such an impact with his critique in Time magazine about the... Because you say in the book that he'd only sold 2,500 copies up to that point.
That's right. That's true. Well, I don't... I hadn't thought of it. I mentioned Whittaker Chambers for obvious reasons, because of his, as it were, inside knowledge of the workings of the party. But I don't think it was Chambers alone. I mean, actually, I think the real answer to the monetary situation is more mundane. It was chosen as a Book of the Month club. And in those days, Book of the Month club books were, as you may remember, were extraordinarily popular and sold in the hundreds of thousands, if not more. So I think that combination of things, I think the other thing, which is absolutely obvious, of course, when he wrote it in 1939, it was just before the outbreak of World War II. It was extremely well received, but disappeared, of course, in the maelstrom of the war, which accounts, among other things, for its miserable sales. After the war, actually, for a while, it was banned in Germany by the Americans and the British because of the cooperation with the Soviet army in occupied Germany. But very soon after that, it was seen as an extremely handy weapon in the Cold War. And I think that guaranteed its success. And I know from my American friends that it actually was taught in schools, well, right up until really till the fall of the wall, and perhaps beyond it, as a set book.
On Sunday, December 27th, you led, this is, I assume, a dream of anybody writing a book, you led the New York Times book review section.
Yes.
What did you sense? And it was written by Christopher Caldwell, who we had here on the program a couple months ago.
Yes.
You led the book review section. What's
Yes.
your sense of why they thought this book that you're doing is that important?
Well, I think I like to think, they bought my argument that Koestler, we should talk about Koestler and Kessler in a minute. I like to think they bought my argument that he is an extremely important figure still, that his life was significant, and that the books that he wrote remain important and interesting. So I'm hoping that but one should remember, if one wants to be, if not cynical, realistic about it, Sam Tannenhouse, the editor of the New York Times Book Review, wrote the standard biography of Whittaker Chambers. So one could presume that Sam himself had a deep interest in the subject. On the other hand, I don't want to suggest that he's venal in any way. Certainly, I had no inkling that this was going to happen until about a week before it happened.
What impacts it had on you so far?
Well, it's brought in a flood of emails. But I would say that the review in the New Yorker by Louis Menand, which was a much longer and, to my mind, much more serious review and much more in tune with my own thinking about Koestler, had just as big an impact.
So how do you pronounce his last name?
Well, it depends on where you are. In Europe and among the cognoscendi, if you like, it's Koestler, because it's a German name. But in America, the standard pronunciation is Kessler. And I'm not sure if this is a result of American difficulty with foreign languages, that is the exoticism, although, of course, this country's absolutely crammed with people from every corner of the world, or whether it just grew up at a time before he had actually appeared here and told people how his name was pronounced. So it's generally Kessler here in Britain, and on the continent of Europe, it's Koestler.
You say you met him once in 1980.
Yes.
What were the circumstances, and when did you first get interested in? How many years have you spent in his life?
Well, I say nearly 20. It is nearly 20 at the beginning, but you have to remember that when I say 20 years, that was 20 years spent full-time teaching. So we're talking 20 years of vacations interspersed with a few sabbaticals.
Teaching where, by the way?
Oh, I was teaching Russian literature at Cornell until 1994. And after that, I moved to Columbia to teach nonfiction writing and translation, which is my other hat that I wear.
So you're meeting with him?
Yes. So, back in 1972, I founded a magazine called Index on Censorship, which, as its name implies, was about censorship. Censorship in the arts, but censorship of political books as well. And this I edited for 8 years until 1980, when I resigned to write my first biography, which was of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But one of the backers of the magazine was David Astor, who also published a lot of Koestler's journalism including Koestler's articles against capital punishment in the anti-hanging campaign. And I was at dinner at David's one evening, and he invited Koestler over to meet me to talk about the magazine. And Koestler was interested in passing on this information to people he knew who were writing in what was then still Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, and particularly in Hungary.
Now, you say that he spent time in 14 different countries.
Is it 14? I'd forgotten the full number, yes.
Give us the kind of a broad view of where he was, what years was he a communist, and
Yes.
what got him out of that.
Yes, yes. Well, he grew up in Hungary. His family was thrown out by the counter-revolution in 1919 of Béla Kun, who had reacted against a short-lived communist government in Hungary. But so Koestler got a taste of communism very early in his school days, actually. He went to school and university in Vienna. Vienna, which was saturated in anti-Semitism at the time. He became a Zionist, and then, virtually on an impulse, moved to Palestine. I say virtually on an impulse. He was failing in his university studies. And in his autobiography, he sort of covered up the real reason. But the fact is, he left to get away, and to get away from his parents. But of course, one could leave without going all the way to Palestine. So he clearly had a very adventurous spirit. And as a Zionist, he wanted to see the Promised Land for himself. It was there that he became a journalist, writing at first for obscure Hebrew journals, although he wrote his articles in German.
Who's the other fellow in the picture right here with him?
Do you know? I don't know who that is. This is an unknown fellow journalist, I imagine. It was taken in Jerusalem in 1928, I think. At the time, just when he had begun working for the Holstein press in Germany as a foreign correspondent.
By the way, some of the photos we're showing, they're all from your book. Are they?
Yes.
This first time people have seen them in your book?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, no. In the Kessler archive at Edinburgh, which has this huge collection of papers that he saved, there are dozens and dozens of photographs. It was very difficult to make a selection, actually. I would have liked to print twice as many, but didn't get the chance.
University of Edinburgh.
University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Yes.
Go back to
Yes.
Palestine. You were talking
Yes.
about the countries you lived in.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about he was a very young tyro journalist in Palestine. But the Middle East that he described about oil discoveries and the rush and the competition between Russia and Britain and France and America for influence there, and also his articles on Arabic politics. He wrote about the Wahhabis, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, whom he called the Bolsheviks of the Arab world. Have a strikingly modern ring to them. I was astounded going back. Anyway, he trained himself as a journalist in the Middle East, but by this time he was tired of Zionism, tired of Palestine, which was still under the British. The Mandate was what it was called after the end of World War I, and moved to Paris briefly and then to Berlin, where he became a journalist with the main Holstein group of newspapers, and particularly a paper called the Vossische Zeitung. And because of his interest in science and some articles that he published on science, he very quickly got promoted to science editor. And people forgot this when he turned to writing about science later in his life, that he did have this intense experience for 2 or 3 years in Germany.
By the way, he wrote how many books in his life?
34 all told.
How many of those were novels? How many of them were nonfiction?
There are 5 novels, and 5 5 novels, a couple of plays, and the rest are nonfiction.
And of the nonfiction, which ones were the most successful?
The most successful, all of his nonfiction was pretty successful, actually. And I make the case in my book that one of the reasons why Kessler has been more forgotten than he should have been is that people tended to think of him as a novelist because of Darkness at Noon, whereas none of the other novels came up to that novel in quality. But in fact, he was a much better writer of nonfiction, and particularly his autobiographical nonfiction, Dialogue with Death, about his imprisonment and sentence to death in Spain, was his first.
Did he go from Berlin to Spain?
No. He went from Berlin to the Soviet. He joined the Communist Party. This was at the time of the rise of Hitler, you may remember. He joined, like many Jews at the time, he joined the Communist Party and got himself to the Soviet Union on the pretext of writing a political travel book to be called Red Days. Traveled around the Soviet Union at one time with Langston Hughes, whom he bumped into in Central Asia. And I had great fun writing about their trip and their views of one another.
How did you, and there's a picture of him with Langston Hughes, how did you find all that background information on that meeting? And what city were they in Russia?
Well, they met in Samarkand, which is, of course, has a nice romantic ring to it. They traveled to Tashkent, but they also moved around in some rather small villages and settlements as well. Actually, I found some of the material is in their published autobiographies. Langston Hughes published an autobiography. Koestler too in Arrow in the Blue, his first volume of autobiography. But then I also found the Langston Hughes papers at Yale in the Beinecker Library and read them, including his personal diaries and a couple of letters. And in Koestler's case too, at Edinburgh University Library, that was another place where I found his journals as well.
How long did he stay in Russia?
Just over 18 months.
Communist the whole time he's there?
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Did he really believe in the communist system, or was this?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think, I mean, part of Kessler's charm, if you like, but what makes Kessler impressive was the degree of immersion that he achieved in every ideology, if you like, that he pursued. When he was a Zionist, he was an impeccable Zionist, and he insisted on digging down to the intellectual roots of Zionism, mastering it, understanding it, and absorbing it. When he became a communist, he did exactly the same thing. He became an absolute expert in dialectical materialism, he had an amazing way of assimilating ideas, in particular books and ideas. And I've been rather amused to read in one or two of the reviews, let's say some of the more skeptical or hostile reviews. Well, Kessler was in Kharkov in the Ukraine in the early 1930s when there was a famine, but ignored it or pretended it wasn't there. But it was Kessler himself who pointed this out later in life. He admitted these things. He understood that he had been blinded in his enthusiasm. Now you can regard this as a defect or a virtue, whichever way. Once he entered into something, he was blind to, in many ways, to its defects.
We're in the middle 30s, and he marries for the first time. And I want to go through the 3 marriages he had.
Okay.
And show the pictures of the 3 women, and then ask you to tell us what the marriages were like. The first one was 1935, Dorothy?
Yes, that's it. Kessler, by this time, was back in France, working for the Comintern as a journalist and propagandist, if you like. Although he was very down on his luck when he met Dorothy. They were both working for a man called Willy Münzenberg, who was a leading propagandist for the Popular Front and for the communists in France. Dorothy was a social worker who'd grown up, also Jewish, in a quite well-to-do family in Germany. which had lost all its money during the Depression, as did Kessler's parents, by the way. She was extremely left. She herself was a communist, and they met while he was working for something called the Free German Library in Paris.
How did you get the backstory on this marriage?
There's very, very little in his autobiography because of the difficult circumstances of their divorce and the bitterness that ensued. He promised Dorothy that he would not describe their marriage at any length. And they parted. They parted about. Well, let's see. He was. While they were still together, he went off to Spain and was imprisoned, so he was away for months and months and months. And they parted soon after he was released from Spain.
Which
although
was roughly what year?
She helped to secure his release, 1930. Now, let's see. You know, dates are my nemesis, even though I have them in the book. I think it was 1937. 1938 certainly was when he was back in Britain and parted from Dorothy.
Did she write about their life together?
Never, no. And I was extremely lucky in that I managed to track her down at the very beginning of my researches and shortly before she died.
What year?
What year was this?
Did you track her down?
Did I track her down? It must have been 1990.
So it's been a long time
like
ago.
That. Oh, a long, long time ago, yes. That's why my memory is a little...
But you talked with her.
I did. Very reluctantly at first. I found her in the London telephone book. And and the address was there. I wrote her a letter, and then I telephoned her, and she very grudgingly said I could come and visit her. No notes.
You weren't allowed to take notes?
I wasn't allowed to take notes. Immediately after that conversation, I rushed down the street to the first cafe I could find, sat down and wrote down everything that she had said and I had said. I'm not sure I can equal Truman Capote in this regard, but it's something that biographers and writers have to do sometimes. It's not uncommon for one to be told you can't take notes. But any writer worth his salt, well, and I think it's understood even by the person who says don't take notes, that you're going to make use of that conversation.
How long did you spend with her?
I spent about an hour and a half the first time, and I went back for a second visit and probably spent a little longer than that, about 2.5 hours.
What'd she tell you about their marriage and about the man?
She was very tight-lipped. She told me a bit about herself and her background. She told me about how they met, and how they went to Switzerland. But she spent quite a bit of the time stonewalling my questions. It was very difficult to get information out of her. Quite frequently she would say, I don't want to talk about that. She certainly gave me no intimate information on their relationship. She was much happier, which is sort of characteristic of people who were communists in those times. She was no longer a communist, but she still loved to talk about politics.
The next marriage was 1950. Who was that to?
Excuse me, I should add one thing to that. What we did spend a lot of time talking about actually was her life after she and Koestler parted, because she was stranded in occupied France. He got out just in time.
During the war?
Yes, at the beginning of the war, yes. But he helped her a lot, which he acknowledged. He sent her money. He tried to get her visas to Mexico and the United States, all of which failed because the Germans by then were in full occupation of France.
Second marriage, 1950.
Mamaine Paget, the strikingly beautiful identical twin who had been a debutante in England. They met through Cyril Connolly. She had been a friend of Connolly. She had worked briefly for Horizon, Connolly's this famous literary magazine in England at the time. And Connolly and his friends, I'm trying to think of their names now, and Connolly and a couple of friends of his were actually living in an apartment owned by Mamaine Paget. So
it's just like this sound like Maine, like the state
yes,
bank.
Maine, yes, yes, yeah, an unusual name. I don't think I've come across it anywhere else.
And you talked to her sister?
I talked to her sister at great length and over many years, yes.
How was that introduction made, and what value was that to you?
Well, her sister Celia was remained on very close terms with Kessler until the very end of his life. She was shocked by the suicide, and in fact she had discussed with Kessler and Cynthia the possibility of Cynthia coming to live with her after Kessler's death, because it was obvious that he was dying towards the end. Celia was, despite the turbulence of his marriage to Mamain and the very bad way in which he frequently behaved with her, she was devoted to Kessler. Celia was, as was Mamain, by the way. And so when she heard that I was writing the book, I instantly contacted her, and she was extremely friendly. And not only did she speak at great length and freely about the relationship between Kessler and Mamain, but she had, at an earlier stage, published a collection of Mamain's correspondence with Kessler, partly to counter an earlier biography of Kessler, which emphasized how bad the relationship was, partly to counter that. But what Celia gave me were the unpublished portions of that correspondence, and Mamain's diaries for that period as well. And so I was able to draw on them to add a great deal, both a great deal that was negative, showed Kessler in a bad light, but also a fair bit that showed him in a much better light than had previously been known.
Where had Kessler and Dorothy lived, and where did he live with Mamain, and what was the turbulence all about?
Well, Kessler and Dorothy, I mean, were total paupers in Paris. I mean, they could barely scrape two pennies together. She actually was better off than he, because she did have a regular job with an agency doing social work. So they lived in one room for quite a long time. They then went off to Switzerland because her brother had moved to the Soviet Union, another communist, a physician who'd moved to do good there, ended up being jailed and executed in the purges. But they were offered this apartment in Zurich where they moved. And there were, oddly, it was interesting, there were a lot of, although Switzerland was strictly neutral, as it always has been, there were a lot of communists who were supposedly not supposed to sort of practice their ideology and so on. I recently read a biography of Ignazio Silone. I knew that Kessler had met Silone, the Italian novelist there, and there was a whole communist circle operating there. True, they weren't interfering in Swiss politics, but they were very much a group with their own ideology and their own context.
Mamain and Koestler were married for how long, and where did they live?
Well, Mamain and Kessler got together fairly soon after World War II. They lived in Wales to begin with, in an obscure part of southern Wales, in a place whose name I can still not pronounce properly. I think I won't attempt it. But the thing about Kessler, as with Dorothy, he was constantly on the move. While he was with Dorothy, he had gone to Hungary for a while. He was in Spain. While he was with Mamain, he rushed off to Palestine, first to write a novel, Thieves in the Night, about the struggle between the Jews and the Arabs that was already beginning. And they both together went again during the war, which became the war for Israeli independence in 1948. So they lived in Wales. They lived for a brief while in London. They also lived in Paris. After 1948, they lived in Paris for about 3 years. They lived together for a year in the United States, too.
How long did he in total live in the United States?
Not long. He had intended to settle in the United States. He decided that Europe was finished and he would move here. And he came in 1951. Mamain came afterwards. They lived together for just over a year, and I think he was here for just over 2 years in the end.
Was there a public renouncement on his part in this time frame about communism, or was that the Darkness at Noon book.
There was a renunciation which was not public, which in 1938 already he wrote a long letter to the Communist caucus in Paris, announcing his decision to resign from the party. I found this letter in the Comintern archives in Moscow. And I published it actually in the New Republic soon afterward, many years ago, the letter more or less in full. He decided that he couldn't stay with the party anymore. He resigned. He gave all the reasons why, including the show trials, the lack of freedom in the Soviet Union, the complete lack of freedom within the party itself. But as a gesture to the Soviet Union and to old loyalties, he agreed to keep the letter secret. And it remained secret until I found it in Moscow in
How did you find
1990. I found it by a rather roundabout route. I was in Israel, actually, doing some research on Kessler's time there. And in one of the archives there, and I actually forget which one it was now, I met an archivist who said, you know, there are some of Kessler's papers in Moscow. And I said, how do you know that? Well, he didn't tell me at the time. I believe he already had some of them in his own archive at that point. What happened was this. Kessler was tracked by the French police as a communist, as a former communist, and as an enemy alien. He was jailed by the French for several months in a concentration camp, Le Vernet, in the south of France. The French confiscated his papers. In fact, they confiscated Darkness at Noon. The novel's original manuscript has never been found. It only exists in translation. The English translation that Kessler made with his English girlfriend at the time, Daphne Hardy, is actually the text. And when it had to be published in German, he had to help translate it back into German. So the French had this stash, this large collection of papers on Arthur Kessler. And when the Germans occupied France, the Gestapo took the French police archives and took them back to Berlin. And there they stayed throughout the war. When the Red Army occupied Berlin, the Red Army took the Gestapo archives, which included the French police archives, and took them all back to Moscow.
Do you ever, when you finally get that document, do you ever just shake your head and say, I cannot believe I found this?
It's true. It's true. When this was before the fall of the wall, but this was during the time of the Gorbachev perestroika. So they were beginning to make these things available, but very grudgingly, and it was very, very hard work to get there. And I myself, as someone who had worked on Solzhenitsyn and with the dissidents, I had been banned from the Soviet Union for years and years and was persona non grata there. So I wasn't even sure I would get a visa. I got the visa and I found this archive with great difficulty, and it was freezing cold there when there were no facilities whatsoever. And there were 9 folders, I remember, of material. But
do you speak Russian?
I do, yes.
Where did that, let me interrupt, where did that start?
Oh, well, that started in the British Army. I'm old enough to have done national service, which was compulsory when I was young, 2 years from 18 to 20. And while I was in the British Army, I had done rather well in languages at school. I personally didn't really want to learn Russian, but one doesn't have a lot of choice. So I was sent to this training course, which ended up in Cambridge University for a year, studying Russian. It's rather like the courses that are taught in Monterey, or were taught at Monterey here. But the absurd thing is, I spent the almost the entire time of my national service studying Russian. Never ever used it in any practical way, but it changed my life. I then went to university and got my first degree in Russian.
Where?
At Nottingham University.
You were born over
Yes,
in
yes,
England.
I was born in Britain, yes. I then, after working in the former Yugoslavia for a while teaching English, I then came to graduate school at Columbia on the Fulbright program and studied Russian at Columbia. And although I did, I went back to the UK after 4 years here. Yeah, I guess it planted a seed. While I was publishing Index on Censorship, I used to come here regularly, partly to try and get circulation here, and partly to raise money from foundations to help pay for it. And after writing the Solzhenitsyn book, it was such a huge success here that I began to get job offers. And so I moved. I was at the, in fact, none of those original job offers materialized. But eventually, after I spent 6 months at the Woodrow Wilson Foundation here in Washington, Woodrow Wilson Institute, as it's called, 6 months at Harvard, and then I was offered the job at Cornell University teaching Russian literature. And that pretty much sealed my fate, except that I very much wanted to stay here by then.
Let's go back to the third marriage, which was to Cynthia Jefferies.
Yes.
1965.
Yes.
What were the circumstances?
Well, Cynthia had been his secretary. Cynthia became his secretary while he was living with Mamain in Paris. She was a stenographer, if you like, but she was also a rather beautiful young woman. She was also rather vulnerable. She had a record, according to her sister, whom I found in England and interviewed. As a young woman, she had been, her father had committed suicide when Cynthia was just a child, and she had been rather attracted to sort of strong, masterful, we even say bullying men. Kessler was certainly all of those things, and they very soon started an affair.
She's in the picture over there, the second from the right.
Yes.
Yeah. In the
no.
back.
No. Oh. Yes, she is. Yes. I can only just see the details from here. She's second.
Isn't she in the dark in the back?
Yes, that's her. Yes. Sorry, I couldn't see it in the. I now I spot.
And they were married for
Yes,
18 years
yes.
until the suicide.
That's right. Yes. Well, she was his secretary for a while. They separated, and then he called her back to work for him after he and Mamain divorced. And she again worked for him for many years as his assistant and secretary. Finally, made herself so indispensable. And he was planning a trip to the United States, to Stanford, actually, and wanted to bring her with him, and ran into the situation where it would not be acceptable to come with someone who was not his wife and live with her openly. This is in 1965. And so they married. They actually married in New York City at City Hall.
So the women in his life, seems like a couple stories in there, obviously his writing and
Yes.
the different places
Yes.
he lived.
Yes.
But the women, there's a quote you used somewhere in his diary that said he had slept with between 100 and 200 women. What does that represent, in your opinion, from what you learned about him?
Well, he suffered from what I guess psychoanalysts would call satyriasis. He himself diagnosed this in one of his autobiographies, An Arrow in the Blue. That is, he was constantly running after women all his life. He seemed to have this insatiable need. And he would often, sleeping with them would often be a prelude to very long friendships. I interviewed many women who had had affairs with him. Some of them were quite sort of amused and detached and humorous about it, and said that he just had this mania, and it sort of reassured him. I mean, he had an enormous inferiority complex.
How big was he?
5'6".
How else would you describe him personally?
Personally, well, he had quite a magnetic personality. One of his attractions was he had a boy. He never grew up, which is a plus and a minus. But everyone I spoke to, men and women who've known him very well, were in his middle years and some in his early years, said he had this schoolboyish air. He loved to play games, he loved to play pranks, but he took them all extremely seriously. He took ideas extremely seriously. He didn't take convention seriously, and he didn't take manners seriously. He was an enfant terrible in many ways.
What did he sound like?
What did he sound like? Well, he had this very strong German accent. He spent the 3/4 of his life actually in the English-speaking world, speaking mainly English. And he had this very strong German accent that he was very ashamed of and hated, but could never master phonetics. He spoke about 5 languages pretty fluently at one time. But I forget who was it. I forget whether it was Malraux or Camus who said, Kessler doesn't speak French, he massacres it. And the same was true of English. And so people like yourselves were constantly trying to get him first into the radio studio and then into TV studios, and he constantly resisted. He hated people hearing the way he spoke.
His relationship with George Orwell, Albert Camus, Whittaker Chambers,
yes.
Important relationships?
Yes, I think so. I'd like to get away a little bit from the personal and talk about why those relationships were important and why I think Kessler was so important. Of course, I write at great length about his personality too, but the real reason to write about him is what is for what he wrote. And the thing about Kessler, I mean, I don't put Whittaker Chambers, I have to say, in the same league anywhere near as a writer, but Kessler was in that mold of Malraux, Ignazio Silone, Camus, Sartre, if you like. In the English-speaking tradition, people like Dos Passos, shall we say, Steinbeck, Hemingway certainly, who believed that a writer should be not just a writer, but a man of action as well. That there should
What does that mean?
Well, that they should participate particularly in the politics of the day, that they should go to hotspots, if you like, to visit countries. They were particularly attracted to revolutions, André Malraux revolutions in China, Kessler revolutions in the Soviet Union.
What do you personally think of that idea as it relates to you? Do you believe that for yourself?
No, I think, well, yes and no. Now it seems to be much more the business of foreign correspondents. Our correspondents fly to Iraq or to China or to Sudan, to Central Africa. But it was very much, for the 20th century, it was a very strong phenomenon, and a distinct vein of literature grew out of this approach. And it was the attraction particularly to left-wing ideas, to socialism, which powered this. And in Kessler's case, I link it particularly to the idea of this search for utopia. For Kessler, Zionism was the first utopia. It was to allow Jews to live happily, to escape anti-Semitism, and to become, as he thought, normal. He didn't, at the time, he didn't think Palestine would do it. Certainly it didn't do it for him. He later became a communist because he witnessed the consequences of the Great Depression, the poverty, the extreme poverty, the deprivation of the working classes, and he felt that socialism had the answer. And it was this that drew him to communism and to the Soviet Union, as it drew Malraux, it drew Camus, it drew Silone, it drew Sartre. And let's say Dos Passos and Steinbeck, if we look at American examples, were not quite that far to the left, but they weren't very far. I mean, they certainly were very close to that way of thinking. And all these men traveled. And of course, the great catalyst was the Spanish Civil War. And you could say that what saved this, at least what saved this, what kept this utopianism, and particularly the socialist version alive for so long, was the rise of fascism.
Why did Franco of Spain throw him in jail?
Because he was known to be a communist. I don't think it was. I don't think Franco or Franco's men were aware of the full depth of Kessler's involvement in communism, but they'd found him at the front. They'd found him. They were aware that he had been visiting the Republican forces in the battle for Malaga, and the Republicans' allies and biggest supporters were the communists at this time. So they accused him. Ironically, Kessler was a real interferer, a sort of do-gooder, and at the Republican headquarters, he'd actually tried to advise the Spanish general, about the things he was doing wrong and why his troops weren't up to the job and so on. I mean, it was said of Kessler that when he met Einstein, he explained the theory of relativity to him. He was that was part of that boyish ebullience, if you like, that earnestness which was always with him. And he was always totally into whatever he was doing.
Let me ask you about your work on this book. When did you get down to writing? What year?
Oh, it was written over such a long period. It's hard. I'd have to look at my own diaries to tell you. I think it must have been in about 1996, something like that.
And when did you finish writing?
Not many months ago, actually. I finished the main body of the book just over a year ago.
You said you did 200 interviews.
Yes.
Did you capture all that on tape except for Dorothy's interview? Or
a lot of them were on tape, but I wrote a lot of them down. An experienced interviewer would tell you that people sometimes are shy of tape recorders. And don't like, sometimes they explicitly don't like them, sometimes you notice that they don't.
You say you're adventuring into a new idea with your website and e-notes?
Yes. Well, one of the things I had to do, this book is big enough, goodness knows, but not as big as the Solzhenitsyn book. And I actually had more material than I had for the Solzhenitsyn book. So a lot of my time towards the end was spent cutting. I cut, I'd say, probably close to somewhere between 80 and 100,000 words from my original manuscript. I cut an enormous amount. Now, some of this obviously is dross or long-windedness, but I collected a lot of, I had a long correspondence with Koestler enthusiasts or people interested in various aspects of European politics in the 20th century, the politics of communism and so on. And about the scientific works too. So, and I know that there are people interested in this material, but there are a small minority of readers of such a book. So I plan to put quite a lot of that on my website and say, here's some other material. I want to save other people from going and digging for the same stuff. And in some of the cases, I'll expand on what's in the book.
How big was his diary and where is it?
His diary was kept only intermittently, and there are various kinds. There are journals which start and stop. There are detailed diaries which start and stop as well, and then a kind of appointments diary which he kept throughout his life. They're all in Edinburgh University.
As you think back on this project, what were the most important ingredients that got you the bulk of what you have in this book?
Well, diligence is obviously one of them. I do, like Kessler himself, speak a number of languages, which makes it rather easier. I can research in French, German, Spanish, and Russian without too much difficulty. I draw the line at Hebrew. So that was one element. I think the other thing is I've always been a long-distance runner. When I was in school, I was hopeless at the sprint. but I was very good at cross-country and long distance. Somehow, people say to me, didn't you get bored? Aren't you fed up? I enjoyed every minute of this. I was fascinated by him, fascinated by the book. The book, I wrote it, in many ways I wrote it novelistically. Like most, I suspect, biographers, I once wanted to be a novelist. This is my novel, if you like, on one level. But it's a novel filled with research, and it's also an intricate jigsaw puzzle.
Where did you write it?
I wrote it partly in Ithaca at Cornell, in the house I had there. I wrote it partly in New York, and partly a great deal of it in a summer house that we have in New Hampshire, close to my wife's, actually my wife's birthplace.
What will make this a success for you?
I would like, this book is, I think, put together in a rather sophisticated fashion. I would like some appreciation for the art that went into it, the construction of it, the pacing. Secondly, the ideas in it. It's a kind of primer on 20th century politics, particularly the politics of the left. And then I mentioned the idea of Kessler in particular, but the other novelists as utopians, if you like. I also recently came across a very interesting comment which opened my eyes to one aspect. Kessler, and I think most of these fellow novelists that I've mentioned, and many other people in the 20th century, was at base a religious man. But he lived in a century that was not religious, and he sought particularly moral and ethical imperatives in politics. And in Kessler's case, he later sought those things in science. And neither science nor politics could deliver what he was really searching for.
It's either Kessler or Koestler. And our guest has been Michael Scammell at Columbia University, professor. And you can get additional information at michaelscammell.com.
Thank you, yes.
Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.